If one person is looking at a painting or a sculpture, and you're not even participating in it to the level that, say, you participate in music when you're hearing it. If you're hearing it as background music, then it's background music. If you're walking through the Whitney Museum and you're just glancing at things outside of it, well, it's background painting. Well, if you look at the painting and you're not actually part of it, but you're only saying, oh, it's this style or that style, it's nothing. And unfortunately, that's probably the way 99% of art is experienced as a category, as intellectual judgments. If you actually aren't carried away, if you actually aren't physically moved and, like fearing for your life and sanity, then it's almost like not working, in my opinion. That's, again, going back to the 50s phrase, working. Does the painting work? If you actually don't lose your breath, if you don't, lay down and die, if you actually aren't run out of the place, if your heart rate doesn't go up, if you actually don't lose your breath.
Something's got to happen to you.
Right, and something major. If it doesn't fulfill those simple requirements, if it doesn't even give you the feeling you'd have swimming in the ocean or riding a horse or, any of the heavy drug experiences you might have, if it doesn't match any very important, powerful experience you've had in your life, it isn't a real work. All I wanted out of my own work was that if you ever came to an exhibition, that you would absolutely just, never forget it.
Walter de Maria is an artist who really came of age in the 1960s and worked within the context of minimalism, conceptual art. He was born in California, studied at Berkeley, where he was very involved with music, and then came to New York, where he established his studio.
His early work explored construction-based work, ideas about movement, banality, repetition, measure, drawings he described as invisible. He explored the limits of perception and ideas about what is seen and what is known. Really thinking about how everyday movements might be thought of through an aesthetic lens, or how an aesthetic lens might reframe how we understand our everyday movements.
I think he had a great interest in really giving agency to the viewer, but through something that he had controlled. So it's this sort of interesting dichotomy between something highly controlled as an experience, but also quite open-ended in terms of what the viewer brought to the situation. Working with a variety of materials, first early on working in wood, and then eventually in the latter part of the 60s beginning to work more in metal, and then literally going into the landscape itself.
The works of art are in demand of the artist, and this was Walter de Maria. He worked all his life that direction. And as you know, the Earth Room, and as you know, the vertical Earth kilometer, as you know, the Broken Kilometer, as you know, the lightning field, if you see these settings, you know Walter de Maria better than he knew himself.
There's an amazing drawing that exists in the archive, and it's the object, the action, the aesthetic feeling. And I think it actually sums up so much. The object, the action, in a way, produces the aesthetic feeling. And it's something to keep in mind in terms of the experience of the work. Those three parts, what the work brings to you, what you bring to it, and then together, in a way, what you create.
Heiner Friedrich first met Walter de Maria in 1963 through the artist Robert Whitman. They developed a dialogue that coalesced into a show in 1968 at Friedrich's Gallery in Munich. They started imagining other projects that de Maria could need support for that were immersive in scale or needed land to be realized. They developed a really lively rapport at the same time that Heiner and the other founders at DIA start to talk about alternative models for supporting artists.
It's safe to say that many of the projects Walter realized would not have been possible without the support of DIA. DIA Art Foundation essentially is a patron, and so these projects that require purchasing land, supporting fabrication, installation, maintenance of a work, particularly any kind of long-term installation, is exceedingly different for any conventional institution to take on.
There are in total 12 DIA sites and locations, 4 of which are Di Maria's permanently cited works of art. And I think that speaks to the early commitment and belief in Di Maria's ideas and vision. One thing that I think is astounding about the Di Maria sites is that each of them has been stewarded or cared for by somebody for an extended period of time. So something about Di Maria, something about the works really has generated kind of fidelity among the people who are responsible for these works, who just knew and understood every aspect of it, and also had the expert knowledge of how people encounter it and could kind of help facilitate that experience for people, direct them if they had questions, but also just kind of be a welcoming presence to make people feel invited into the space.
When you go to the lightning field, when you go to the Broken Kilometer, when you go to the Earth Room, there is no photography allowed. And the images of those works that are often required and requested for reproduction and publications, we provide those images. So these were images that were approved by Walter de Maria during his lifetime, and those are the images that are let out into the world.
Di Maria was very conscious of overexposure, shall we say, kind of shockingly prescient about our current cultural moment. He understood that people needed to have some information about the work to understand it and to generate interest and excitement, but he was really conscious of not overexposing the work.
Obviously, it was a different era of the 60s, but, we're already looking at a time in the rise of advertising and the ubiquitous nature of television. But, if you fast forward to now, it really feels radical.
I mean, there are times where I tell people, I go so far as to suggest that he thought it may corrupt the experience. And some people need to hear it that way.
He just wanted you to be there now. Be there now.
I must say, when I invited Walter de Maria to Munich in '68 and asked him for an exhibit to present, we did what he had suggested and filled the whole gallery with earth. It was center Munich. I mean, people couldn't believe what happens.
From the 1968 Earth Room, Di Maria realized another version in 1974 at a museum in Darmstadt, this time using gravel. And then in 1977, in October, a third version of that work opened, originally as a temporary exhibition at one of the spaces that Heiner Friedrich owned in Soho, and was on view until January of the following year, 78, when the space was closed for renovations so that Dia Art Foundation could reopen the New York Earth Room as a permanent work of art in January of 1980.
The Earth Room's in the middle of the block on Wooster Street, west side of the street between Hausen and Prince. And, there have been people who've thought that Wooster Street could be written about like certain streets in Paris as significant art streets of New York City. Certainly the Earth Room is part of that story. It's a neighborhood that has evolved and continues to evolve, as does the city. So whereas everything out there is evolving rapidly and changing, that's the thing that makes the Earth Room so radical, is that it's here and remains the same.
The Earth Room is located at 141 Wooster Street in Soho, New York. It's a cooperative building. There are people living in it. It's residential. You go and you have to buzz a buzzer. So it really is like visiting someone's loft, because it's in this loft building and you're buzzed up without any fanfare. So it really adds, again, to this experience that feels very everyday. And then, you're in this thing that isn't very everyday.
You come up the steep staircase, you enter the space, you come down a narrow hallway, and there it is to your right.
You can immediately perceive the presence of the earth through the smell of kind of moist, humid air.
And it's a narrow viewpoint. It's about arm span, stretching hard, a little wider than arm span. And so it's limited. People can have a very private experience of the Earth Room without even seeing me.
You see this huge gallery with lighting that is just bare light bulbs and a huge space filled with earth, held back by a glass partition so that you actually see the earth in its depth, and then the surface of it. And it's just kind of wild, and that's the thing about it, is that it's just so surprising, even on repeated visits. I never ever lose my fascination. Every time I go there, I just think it's just such a wild thing. It's such a fantastic thing.
I think it's not without humor, right? That there's this apartment filled with earth on the second floor of a building in the middle of Soho that's been there since the 70s. And one of the reasons why Di Maria was so deliberate about only providing factual information about the work is because that interpretive work was up to the viewer.
If I had to compare it to something, there's an incredible Magritte painting called The Listening Chamber. It's one of my favorite paintings. It's a very tiny room with a giant green apple that just goes to the edge of the walls. It's so incongruous, and surrealism was so much about bringing disparate elements together and making a new reality out of them, that in some way, the Earth Room is a little bit like that. It expands your mind. That's the thing that's so fantastic about it. Earth, 22 inches deep in this loft.
What was enticing about this job to me was that it was Dia, I knew Dia, and that it was steady work. Because, I was a young artist, and this just seemed to allow me to settle into the art world in a way that was entirely comfortable and personal and meaningful. When I found myself more and more at the desk as the attendance increased, I just started to make a mark for everyone who came in. So to me, this was a way to let the day make a drawing. My job was to just maintain the Earth Room, to keep it visually consistent. I had the photograph, I had the rakes, and that was my job. I just took it from there. And there was no guidance beyond that, and I didn't need any. I understood that that's how it should be presented and preserved. And I have done everything I could over these 35 years to make it presentable in that way. The Earth Room doesn't hit people the way art generally does. It's not what people expect when they go to look at art. And so there's usually a kind of release that happens because people are not just moving along with their expectations. They're kind of derailed a bit by it. And that release can show itself in lots of ways. And one of the ways is laughter. And I've always valued that. Also the quiet. It's like, churches are amazing because they're big spaces that are not loud. And this is a big space that's not loud. So it is reminiscent of a cathedral space, maybe for that reason. The quiet is a big part of it. And that there's nothing else interfering with your experience. So there is this kind of spiritual focus. And by not having anything else here, you're subjected to appointed purpose in reckoning with the earth.
I think Di Maria was interested in the limits of perception. By that I mean the limits of what's knowable and what's unknowable. And measurement is a really useful lens through which to see and explore that idea, right? Because measurement allows us to think that we can apply some order into what is otherwise our chaotic world. But at the same time, it's really hard to see. So the vertical Earth kilometer is a 1,000-meter brass rod that has been inserted vertically into the Earth in a park in Kassel, Germany. It's visible only as a small 2-inch wide circle set in a small square. So you can really only see the top of the rod, and you have to imagine its length, its full kind of materiality. People ask me all the time if it's an illusion, and it is not. You can go to look at the newspapers from '77, you can see Di Maria and crew really did drill down, consulting with engineers and geologists to make this possible. So it is one of the world's largest sculptures, and yet it is essentially invisible.
This is one where you really have to believe And he's done a lot of things like that have very light touch and this sense of invisibility.
And I think that really encapsulates a lot of the ideas that Di Maria had about what a work of art could be, when one can see it, when one can't, what one has to imagine or believe versus what is actually real. From the vertical Earth kilometer, Di Maria imagines yet another way of experiencing this standardized unit of measurement by imagining it divided up into space, so kind of filling a room. The Broken Kilometer is an installation on West Broadway in Soho that consists of 500 polished brass rods laid out in parallel lines, and their total length equals 1 kilometer. The rods are circular, each 2 meters in length, and separated so that they look like they're spaced evenly throughout the space, but actually the space between each rod increases exponentially as they recede to create the illusion of a grid. The space is lit by stadium lighting so that it appears almost to be daylight in the room, so that the rods pop. They really have this kind of glowing presence. But Di Maria was also really interested in the way that that would change over time because, of course, brass oxidizes. And so the rods periodically get polished, which resets a kind of clock. So in a way, the life of the Broken Kilometer is like a timekeeper in and of itself.
It's very easy to walk from the Earth Room to the Broken Kilometer, which is at 393 West Broadway, and that has a direct access from the street, so it's very different than the experience of the Earth Room. You'll see Broken Kilometer on the door, it's very small, and you walk in, and it has more of the feeling of a gallery.
And you come around a corner and it can really kind of take your breath away, especially because of the stadium lighting, which makes you feel almost like you've stepped into the sun or something like that.
I'm the person, I can still say that holds today, unless somebody has 28 years here, that I've spent the most time with it. And this piece is so open-ended. It's different each day. I've been here and been sad, things in my life, or been here and been overjoyed with things. There were times when I was really kind of just, excuse the term, old-fashioned term, grooving on it. But it was true. They really could travel. You can travel looking at this piece. It's way beyond the walls. It's way beyond the ceiling and the floor. It kind of goes.
You have this perspective, forced perspective that's happening. And it's interesting to work with perspective in that way because it's so fundamental when you think about Renaissance perspective, the vanishing point. It's very classical in a certain way. I think it also has a sort of sense of alchemy of taking this material and then drawing out, if you will, the aspects of it through this lighting. And that's very specific on the part of Di Maria, to bring this out.
A whole lot of stuff can happen. We'd have people that would come in and weep because I got this comment a lot that it looks like it's a diary, that the line after line looks like lines in a paper or lines in a life. And sometimes people would come and feel really sad, like, this is like the scrolling out of life. So you get these funny metaphorical things. That's part of the nature of this piece, not to tell you what to think and not to have signage. And just the reading is all boring, how much it weighs and where Walter was born. Doesn't change itself. It's kind of there. It's the person who comes in who's changing. You're changing every day. You kind of come in tomorrow, it would be different than you are today. And then your take on the piece would be different tomorrow than it is today. Our job was to keep this place unchanging. And then people would come in and they would be the ones to bring the change.
DiMaria was interested in wide open spaces that could accommodate the scale that he wanted to work at, which is at the lightning field, 400 stainless steel rods, which are each polished to a point, laid out in a grid that is exactly 1 kilometer by 1 mile long, with, on the diagonal, 220 feet between each pole. He also became interested in this idea of how the environment affects a landscape, and particularly electromagnetic activity.
The lightning field was one of these extraordinary journeys. I mean, it took months and months for Walter de Maria to find the location, to decide the setting of the work.
He spends a lot of time flying over, driving through, and speaking to scientists and other experts, and settles finally on a property in New Mexico that is high, flat, dry, and then in the summers particularly has very high frequency of electromagnetic activity, so high frequency of lightning storms. Everybody was involved. Heiner Friedrich was there all the time, but Helen Winkler and Robert Fosdick, her husband, moved out to the field to help build it and lived for many years as the caretakers for the first few years, and were really instrumental in getting to understand and know how people were coming to and experiencing the field, and sharing that information with Walter so that decisions could be made around what the kind of protocols for the work would be.
My name is Robert Weathers, and I guess me and the lightning field kind of grew up together. I just heard that they was needing help out there, so I just drove out there and asked them for a job. Once the field was finished, a few of us stayed working. At some point, they asked me if I'd like to stay and take care of it, and I didn't know for a while there, but I thought it'd be a good job. They're kind of hard to come by around here, dependable, that maybe you might get a little further in life from cowboying. That's the main reason I stayed, is because I figured it'd be the job for probably as long as I wanted. If it lasted that long, I wasn't sure that there'd be anybody coming to the field for very long, but I was certainly wrong there.
I think what makes the lightning field very distinct is the fact that you are required to go and stay there. It's a 24-hour visit.
Every aspect of going to the lightning field is part of the work of art. The season begins May 1st and ends October 31st, and only 6 people can go at night.
I think one of the biggest nightmares would be tour buses showing up out there.
So reservations have to be written, and originally that was obviously in letter form. Today it's through email. Reservations open for the season on February 1st at midnight Mountain Standard Time. They tend to get booked up relatively quickly.
You can fly into Albuquerque, and you eventually make your way to first the D office in Camado, New Mexico.
You enter the office, you sign a waiver, and you are greeted by the staff of the lightning field, who will take you out in their vehicles to the field.
The thing I remember was being picked up by Robert Weathers, the man with a cowboy hat, a real cowboy. But I had no idea where he was going. We just drove and drove and drove, because it's quite a long distance from there to Camado. I'm, an East Coast gal. I'd never been out to that part of the country, so it was all sort of fantastic.
Some of it's kind of mountainous, hilly and brushy, and then as you get out there, then it starts to flatten out and open up, no trees and stuff. So you have a pretty good variety of landscape, and a lot of dirt road and a lot of mud.
And then you arrive at the field about midday, when the sun is at its highest point, and all you can really see are those like littlest inklings of the rods, because they're polished steel, so when the sun is at the highest point, they kind of reflect or they mirror the landscape around them.
They're like sentinels out there, just standing out there in the middle of the desert, but in very calibrated distances.
You have to see it before you'll ever really understand it, because I can tell you about it all day long and you just think, what?
I mean, the story has always been that if you took a giant plane of glass, you could rest it on top of the polished tips of the lightning field. So that idea of a man-made precision, let's say, in contrast to all the things that form the landscape of this continent, it's also that duality. There is a homestead cabin from, I believe, the 20s, which was, refurbished, renovated by Helen Winkler and her husband, Robert Fosdick. But it's very modest.
There's nothing on the walls. There's nothing kind of animating the cabin. It's really meant to be sparse and bare, but welcoming. A simple meal is provided for the night, and then, things like eggs and milk and orange juice for breakfast.
You are surrounded by mountains. It is about as remote as you could possibly imagine. And you spend 24 hours there. During the day, I walked amongst the rods because it's a huge area to traverse on foot. I didn't experience any lightning. That would have been fabulous and dramatic, but I did not.
People always ask if you need to see lightning to fully experience the lightning field, and that's absolutely not the case. It's really about the relationship between the sculptural objects and your presence in it, more so than it is about lightning per se, although when lightning does strike the poles, it is really, really spectacular.
I'm not a little afraid of lightning, but it's pretty, when it's hitting close, it's intense, yeah.
Over the course of a day, the sun obviously rises and sets, and the perception of the field changes with that passing light. So I think of the field almost like a light box, like a prism.
The other thing that's interesting is when you're in that kind of situation, time really stretches on. There's no diversion. But, looking at the stars, that's what I did.
It can feel transcendent, it can feel terrifying. It is durational, it's really an endurance performance. Di Maria, in a way, invites the viewer to really step up to experiencing the work. You have to get there, then you have to spend the time with the work that's just prescribed by the artist.
I began with a sense of irritation at first, because I kept thinking to myself, what is this? You're already in this beautiful landscape, so do we need this? Is this an intrusion in the land? I really struggled with it, but by the end of it, I understood something, and it brings you back to yourself. And I think that's the thing throughout Di Maria's work, is that if you allow yourself to go through that experience, what you come back to is not the work, you come back to yourself.